We're starting a new series today, which I'm really excited about. I'm curious to see how this is all going to unfold. And that video there is a bit of a taster as to some of the things that we'll be talking about. But this morning, what I'd like to do, just to get started, is I want to talk about something that I really enjoy doing. If I could have free reign over my day, in fact, this is something that I got for my birthday a few years ago, is that Grace organised me to have 12 hours, a whole marathon, 12 hours of board games. So she organised for different groups of friends to come in for 2-hour shifts and play board games with me. I was only allowed to get up to go to the toilet. She organised food and drinks for a whole day, and I loved it. It was amazing. I love playing board games. In fact, one of my goals in life is to have an amazing collection of board games, only the good ones. I want to have my cupboard filled with absolute brilliant games. Because here's the thing, not all board games are created equal, right? Some games are great. Some games are loads of fun. They're absolute winners. You pull them out, you know that you're going to have a good time. But other games, they're no good. Some games are just really poorly designed. They're just really terrible, and some of them can just go on and on and on and on. In fact, there is one game which is very famous. I would pretty much guess that everyone here knows this game, and some people absolutely hate it. Some people would say this is the worst game out there. Any guesses? Monopoly, right? Yes, absolutely. The destroyer of families. Monopoly is, I don't know about you, I could probably guess, but I don't know about you, but for me, when I play Monopoly and I'm winning and things are going really well, I've got my hotels and some really good properties and I'm earning lots of income from other people, it's great. I love it. And it's kind of too great. I can kind of feel the power get to my head and I start to get really smug about it all. And I find it unusually satisfying seeing people hand over their very last dollar to me. But when I'm losing, when I didn't grab the oranges, which I think is the best properties to go for first, if I didn't get the oranges quick enough, I hate it. It's the worst. I just want the game to end. I just want to quit. I just want to leave the game because I just feel the injustice of it all. As soon as I land on someone's property and I have to pay them money, I think this is so unfair. Why do I have to pay you money? In other words, the thing that I see as an injustice when I'm losing is the very thing that I was enjoying when I was winning. And I mean, that might be all well and good in a game of Monopoly, although I do want to acknowledge that there are very real emotions that come out in a game of Monopoly, but at the end of the day, it is just a game. But unfortunately, this kind of thing, this kind of heart attitude is not just left for a game of Monopoly. Unfortunately, so many of us have seen power get to people's heads. I think we've all seen the bully in the schoolyard or in the workplace. So many of us have seen and experienced people manipulate others for their own selfish gain. So many of us have kind of felt that anger boil up within us when we see someone mistreated or when we've experienced it ourselves. And yet, if we're honest, I think we've all had those moments where the power's got to our own head, where we ourselves have misused our own power and we've treated others poorly as well. And so it's like we live in this tension, right? We live in a tension where we see injustice in the world and we see other people misusing their power, and that makes us feel angry. And yet, if we're honest, we ourselves are guilty of the very same thing that makes us angry. So, I think what we need is this we need a transformation of our hearts, and we need a reversal of our power. And this is what we see in the Easter story. When we look at the Easter story, we see Jesus' reversal of power. We see Jesus, although he has all power, he does not assert his power over others as he is going towards the cross. Instead, he powerfully suffered for the sake of others. And this is what I'd like us to explore this month. As this month continues to unfold, we want to explore this in our series called Reversal. In this series, we want to explore Jesus' use of power. We want to see how it is both a reversal of the norm, so it challenges us, right? It challenges the way that we use our power. But even more than that, the brilliant thing is that Jesus, through his death and resurrection, he gives us hope for the final reversal, where the powers that be do not have the final word. And that's good news for a world where we see and experience so much suffering. It's good news. And so that's a little taste of what I hope you're able to take out of this series this month. And in fact, next week is going to be brilliant. We're going to have a guest from Nepal, Dr. Rajendra, and he's going to share with us about his work fighting human trafficking. And I just think it's not a week to miss. So come along next week. But for today, what we're going to do is we're going to be exploring a passage from Mark chapter 10. So if you have your Bibles, could I encourage you to open them up, or Bible apps, open them up to Mark chapter 10. In a moment, we're going to start reading through in verse 35. But before we do, I'd like to just set the scene a little bit for this passage. And as we enter into it, in this passage, it takes place a fair way into Jesus' ministry. So Jesus has already started to gather his disciples. He's already been going around and healing the sick and teaching people. He's already begun this kind of kingdom movement. And Jesus' disciples, they're starting to catch on to the fact that there is something different about their teacher. There is something different about this man, Jesus. But they haven't caught on to the fact that Jesus is bringing a very different kind of kingdom. And they haven't caught on to the fact that the way in which Jesus is bringing the kingdom is very different to the way other kingdoms get established. And that's what we're going to read about in our passage today. We're going to see Jesus' disciples misunderstanding his kingdom, misunderstanding the kind of kingdom he's bringing. And so Jesus sees this as an opportunity to teach his disciples about what true power looks like in a way that is far different from what we're used to, far different from what we see when we look out into the world. And so, before we dive into the passage, could I encourage you, because as I've been reading and rereading this passage in preparation for this sermon, I was already familiar with the passage when I began preparing, but as I continued, it just hit me in a fresh way. And I just felt a fresh challenge from Jesus in this passage. Although they are familiar words, it was a fresh challenge. So could I encourage you, whether you have read this passage 100 times before and you're very familiar with it, or whether perhaps you're here and you're not sure about Jesus and so you're not sure what you think of this passage, could I encourage you to be open to receiving a fresh challenge this morning? Because I would love it if all of you experience the same thing that I experienced when I read through this passage in preparation. It was such a beautiful challenge, and I hope that you can experience something similar as well as we go through it this morning. So that's my invitation for all of you. But as we enter into my message, if I could summarize my message, it would be something like this. I think for us, so often, power is seen in our position over others. But for Jesus, power is seen in the right disposition towards others. I want to explain what I mean by that. I think that so often we see power in our position over others. And this might not be an official position. It might be, there's certainly power seen in someone who has a position of authority. But I think so often we see power when someone has a position of influence over someone else. When someone is able to influence others, whether that be through social media or their relationships with friends and family or whatever it is. It's their ability to influence others. And I think that so often for us, the powerful are those who have that influence. But Jesus sees power differently. Jesus, rather than having a position of influence over others, according to Jesus, true power is in having that right disposition, that right attitude towards others, of choosing to serve and care for and lift up others regardless of who they are and regardless of what they've done to earn it. Rather than our ability to influence others, true power is our willingness to serve others. So these are all just tasters of what I hope you can take out of my message this morning. So we're going to dive into these kinds of things a bit further. So let me not delay it any longer. Let's get into our passage for today. I'd like to invite Jill up, who's going to read the first half of our passage, verses 35 to 40. So thanks, Jill.
Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. "Teacher," they said, "we want you to do for us whatever we ask." "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. They replied, "Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory." "You don't know what you're asking," Jesus said. "Can you drink the cup I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with?" "We can," they answered. Jesus said to them, "You will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with, but to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared."
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jill. All right, so this scene begins with two of Jesus' disciples, James and John. They approach Jesus privately with a wild request, right? I mean, we're going to get to that in a moment, but it's just, golly, okay, what a request. But before we get to that request, I want to talk about James and John, because I actually think it's pretty significant that it was James and John who approached Jesus. I also think it's pretty significant that they're introduced here as the sons of Zebedee. So we're going to get to that. I think there's a couple of reasons why we should see James and John as standing out among the 12 and also standing out in their social class. So first off, they stand out among the 12. James and John, along with Peter, have been invited to join with Jesus in these special moments that the other disciples weren't invited to. So for example, in Mark chapter 5, Jesus raises a girl from the dead and no one was allowed to join him except for Peter, James, and John. Similarly, in Mark chapter 9, Jesus goes up to a mountain and he's transfigured. He starts shining this radiant white. It's quite a remarkable scene. And the only people who are invited to witness this, to join with this, is again Peter, James, and John. And so James and John, along with Peter, are privileged members among the 12 disciples because they've been invited to join with Jesus in these very special moments. But James and John, they also stand out from Peter himself. So back at the beginning of Mark's gospel, we're introduced to Simon Peter and his brother Andrew, and we're told that they are fishermen. And then immediately after they're introduced, we're also introduced to two other brothers, James and John. And we are told that they're also fishermen. However, their father, what's different about them is their father, Zebedee, has hired men. This is one of those things that, I don't know if you're like me, but sometimes I just read over things in the Bible and then have to come back later and actually see the significance. They had hired men. Simon Peter and Andrew didn't have hired men, but James and John's father does. In other words, they're in a household which is able to afford hired servants. And this is something that we're reminded of every time we hear that these are the sons of Zebedee, because Zebedee is the father of the household. So they could have been introduced as these are the brothers, James and John, but instead they're introduced James and John, the sons of Zebedee. So what's the point in this? Well, here in this scene, we have James and John who already have this kind of power and privilege. They're already invited into these special moments. They're already people who have some kind of power in their social class. And here they are approaching Jesus with the intention of trying to accumulate more power, accumulate these special positions on the right and left of Jesus. And it seems to me this is our default use of power so often. So often when we have power and privilege, we seek to accumulate more for ourselves. Rather than using our power to lift up others, we so often use our power to push others down in order to prop ourselves up. And what we're going to see Jesus do is flip the scripts. And he's going to offer James and John and the other disciples a new way of using power. All right, now let's get to that wild request that they ask. They say, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. Whatever we ask. They don't even tell Jesus initially what they're going to ask. They just ask him to sign a blank check for them. It's kind of bold, isn't it? That they would ask something like this. And so they ask him to do for them whatever they ask. And interestingly, these exact words are found on the lips of another powerful leader earlier in Mark's gospel, King Herod. So in Mark chapter 6, Herod is having this party and one of his wife's daughters danced for him and it pleased him and his dinner guests. So Herod said to her, ask for me whatever you want. This is the exact same wording that we read in James and John's request, but here Herod is offering it. And so the girl asks for John the Baptist's head on a platter, and it says that this greatly distressed Herod. This is an honor-shame society where there's a lot of social pressure when things are done publicly. And so when this promise is made, he can't just back out on it. And so he has to follow through on it. So by making this offer, by saying, I'm going to do for you whatever you ask, this powerful leader, supposedly powerful leader, has set a trap for himself. Now that's something that happens earlier in Mark's gospel. There's actually something similar that happens at the end of Mark's gospel as well, with Pilate. And so what's happened here is the religious leaders, they've taken Jesus to Pilate in order to be crucified. And Pilate seems to recognize that there's something different about Jesus. He seems to recognize that Jesus has done no crime. And yet, because he wanted to satisfy the crowd, he hands Jesus over to be crucified. So what we have here is we have these two powerful leaders, Herod and Pilate, showing their powerlessness because they are forced to act against their will and against their own conscience in order to please the people. But not so with Jesus. Jesus does not fall into the same trap here when James and John ask this request. He wants them to show their hand. Rather than giving them whatever they want, he asks them, what is it that you're looking for? And so James and John, they reveal their hand and they say, that when Jesus comes in his glory, they want to sit at his right and his left. So this is a really common image in the ancient world. If you kind of imagine a king sitting on his throne, the two next most powerful people would sit on his right and his left. And this is the image that's coming to mind as James and John make this request. But while James and John are kind of anticipating a military victory, which will bring about the kingdom, Jesus knows that his enthronement will come about through suffering and dying on a cross. And this is what we read about as Jesus is being crucified. It's filled with royal imagery. Jesus is given a crown of thorns on his head. He's given a robe to wear, a purple robe. And purple was the color reserved for royalty because it was so expensive to make back in the ancient world. So he's given a royal robe to wear. And he's mockingly called by the people the King of the Jews and the King of Israel. So James and John are kind of misunderstanding what Jesus' glory really looks like. And when they ask to be on the right and left of Jesus, they misunderstand what that means as well. Jesus says, these places have already been prepared for others. Well, who is Jesus referring to here? Well, there's only one place in Mark's gospel where people appear on the right and left side of Jesus. Only one place. And that is at the cross with the two robbers who are crucified next to him, one on his right and one on his left. Again, the same phrase that we read in our present passage. So while James and John are kind of requesting these positions of privilege in a hierarchy of power that's like the kingdoms of the world, it's like in the image and likeness of the kingdoms of this world, right? Jesus is flipping the script. He's saying that's not how power is going to work among us. He points to the cross where his glory and his power is demonstrated through suffering for the sake of others. It's a challenge that I think it certainly goes right to my heart. It's such a hard thing to take, but I think it's so important. All right, we're going to continue with our passage. I want to invite Anna up now to read the next section. Thank you so much.
When the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many."
Thank you. So good. Oh, man. It's so good and it's so challenging. So you have here the other 10 disciples understandably indignant about what was said, understandably upset that James and John would approach Jesus privately and make this kind of request. But Jesus, he sees this as an opportunity to teach and challenge his disciples. And he begins by pointing out a reality which the other disciples would have known about. Here's a fun fact you can bring out at a party. I don't know how many people will be interested, but I think it's a fun fact. This is the only place in the whole of Mark's gospel where the disciples know anything. Even a few verses earlier, Jesus said, "You don't know what you're asking." This is the only place where they know anything, and what they know is the way in which the rulers rule. This is something that is obvious. That's why even the disciples can know it. Notice that Jesus doesn't say those who are rulers of the Gentiles or rulers of the nations. Jesus says those who are regarded as rulers, those who are apparent rulers, those who appear to be rulers. See, those who are recognized as the powerful only appear to be powerful according to Jesus. In actuality, they are enslaved to their own power. This is what we saw in Herod and Pilate just a moment ago. These are powerful leaders who act against their own will and against their own conscience in order to please the people. And also the way in which they rule is by lording it over others, lording it over the people, by exercising authority over them. This is a top-down kind of power. This is the kind of power that needs to push others down in order to prop ourselves up. And this is the kind of power which has been assumed as essential through much of human history. If you want to be powerful, if it's coming from me, then I need to watch out for other people who might want to take the power from me. But if my power does not come from me, then I'm able to serve others. And I think that's the invitation that Jesus is giving here. Jesus says, it is not so with you. He's speaking to his disciples here. He's speaking to those of us who call ourselves followers of Jesus. This is not the way for us. Jesus is bringing a reordering of our way of using power. He's bringing a reversal to our use of power. Notice as well how Jesus doesn't remove the desire to be great. He doesn't say, don't try to be great or don't try to be first. Rather, he reshapes the way that we express and pursue greatness. He's saying that if you want to be great, then that comes about through serving others. This image of serving and being a slave, it is, I know that this word gets used a lot, but it is radical. It actually is. And I think we get desensitized to this idea of serving others because Jesus is such an effective communicator and we now view serving in such a positive light. It was not the case in Jesus's day. This idea of being a servant and more so being a slave is one that would have been unthinkable. It was not something to pursue. In ancient Greek writings, in ancient Greek philosophy, this image was used always negatively, that you shouldn't be a slave to your desires, for example. And yet, it's being used positively here. This is the socially subversive message of the kingdom of God, where we as Christians, we proclaim a crucified man as our Lord, and we boldly call ourselves slaves of everyone. I mean, how this would have seemed bizarre to so many people. This is a different way of living, a different way of viewing power, a different way of viewing ourselves. This is something that I think is radical, and we should retain that view of it, even if we can kind of get used to it. Okay, coming now to the final verse. This is Jesus' kind of summary of everything that he's been saying, because he begins by the word for. You know, the word for is giving a reason for everything that came before it. And I think it's so important because Jesus is giving himself as an example of what this looks like. He uses this phrase, the Son of Man. And this is a title that comes from the Old Testament, from Daniel chapter 7. This person, the Son of Man, was to be one who received all authority, all power. And Jesus refers to himself in this way, that he is the Son of Man. But even the Son of Man who received all authority and all power did not come to be served. Even he, if anyone's deserving of being served, it's Jesus. But even he came not to be served, but to serve others. For those of us who've said yes to Jesus, those of us who call ourselves Christian, this is the call upon our lives. If Jesus, how much more us? even to the point of giving his life? What might it look like for us to live in such a way that we'd be willing to serve others with our whole lives? I'd like to invite the worship team up as I kind of come to a close here, because I feel like as I've been talking through this passage, my mind goes to high and lofty places, the rulers of the world, or it feels very cosmic sometimes. But we need to remember that Jesus' message is first and foremost for you and for me. So what does this look like for our own lives? What does this look like for your day to day, your week to week? I'd like to end with a couple of questions for you to think about and for you to bring to God if you're willing. One is, who is someone that you find it difficult to serve? Someone who you think perhaps doesn't deserve it? Someone who you think it's beneath you to serve them? If you're honest, like you probably wouldn't say that to others, but maybe if you're honest, you think, oh, it's a bit beneath me to serve them. And what might it look like for you to serve those kinds of people this week? I just want to give you an example from when I was in high school. You know how like there's a couple of teachers usually in high school which everyone just complains about? This certainly happened for me. There was a couple of teachers and everyone used to complain about them. I used to complain about them. And I felt this challenge from God. I sensed God challenging me to write them an anonymous encouragement letter. Write it down, all the things that I genuinely think are great about these teachers, and slip it under the office door with their name on it. And I knew it was from God because I didn't want to do that. But it was such a good thing to do. One of the teachers ended up having some Sherlock Holmes skills and figured out that it was me, and years later reached out and said how much it meant to her. But I think that's that's just one example of what this might look like. I wasn't a fan of these teachers, to be honest. But I really think that this is what serving like Jesus looks like. So could I encourage you, as we enter into this time of worship, maybe give these questions to God. Who are some people that I find it difficult to serve, and what can I do to serve them this week? Let me just pray, and then we'll head into a time of worship. Father, I just thank you that you care so deeply about our world, that you are willing to work with us to transform our hearts, to change the way that we see others, the way that we see our world, and the way that we see power. And I just want to ask that you would help us, because this is not a thing that we can do in our own strength, in our own ability. We need your help. We need your empowering spirit. So may you make us aware of those moments in which we can serve others, even if we see it as beneath us. And may you give us the courage and the ability to not just see it, but to step out and do it. Help us, please, I pray. Amen.